Welcome. This is a presentation on safe injection sites. It's a moral reflection. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Berger, and with me is my co-author, Stephen Boza. Steve contacted me a while ago asking for some input from addiction medicine regarding the ethics of safe injection sites, which is the genesis of this presentation. We worked together on an article which was published in the Lineker Quarterly, and now are offering this to you as a dialogue between the two of us. I am a medical doctor, training in internal medicine and addiction medicine. My current position is medical director at Guest House, which is a lay-run organization for the treatment of Catholic clergy and religious with alcohol and other addictive illnesses.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Boza, and the genesis of this whole article was I live in Philadelphia, and there's a push for safe injection sites in the city, especially in the poor section of the city called Kensington, which is drug infested as it is. And I work for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia as the Office for Life and Family, and my primary role here is in bioethics. I teach bioethics at Catholic Distance University, and I also am getting my PhD in bioethics from the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome. And so this was a very big issue for me and for the Archbishop at the time, Archbishop Chaput. And so I decided to try my hand at writing an article regarding that. And I knew that I couldn't do this on my own. I needed a professional who was involved in addiction medicine that could help me from the vantage point that I don't have. I'm not a physician. I'm an ethicist. And so it's good to have this interdisciplinary approach to this all. So what are safe injection sites? They're legally sanctioned, medically supervised facilities that are designed to curb drug overdoses and reduce public nuisance and harm. This is particularly pertinent in the U.S. today, Philadelphia, and in some places out west. Vancouver has also had one for a number of years, and throughout the world, these are being proposed. They are very dangerous to the life and health of the person who is using drugs, and also to the community.
So in order to talk about this, I want to talk about the nature of addiction, because I think it's important to get an idea about addiction. I'm not going to venture into the disease hypothesis nor the moral hypothesis of addiction. I just want to talk about the nature of addiction. The nature of addiction, I think we can all know intuitively. The behaviors are consistent across the spectrum of substance addictions and process addictions such as gambling. And they are not, the nature of addiction is in itself a destructive nature. The American Society of Addiction Medicine, in its 2011 definition of addiction, pointed out to the progressive nature. Addiction is progressive. It doesn't stay static. Opioid addiction can be punctuated by sudden drug overdose and death, but more commonly, the opiate addiction has a natural history of about 20 to 30 years from the onset of the addiction to the death of the person, and that's a premature death, even as American Society of Addiction Medicine pointed out. Opioid addiction also, in the past, was known to progress naturally and transform into a substance use disorder, most commonly alcohol use disorder, as the street life got harder and harder and harder to maintain with increasing age. So there is a progression to it, and it is not a progression towards wellness. It's a progression towards disability or premature death. There are behaviors which in themselves within addiction are harmful and are characteristic of addiction. They are enumerated in the DSM-5, the 2013 edition of the American Psychiatric Association classification of mental health disorders. And these are harmful behaviors, continuing to use in spite of some form of disastrous consequence. So, for example, a cocaine user who has a heart attack or a stroke yet continues to use cocaine, an alcoholic who continues to drink in spite of the diagnosis of cirrhosis of the liver. These are not well behaviors. The nature of addiction is to change the way the brain functions, and we can see demonstrable abnormalities in brain function, both in physiology. We can tell this through, for example, neuropsychological testing, examining the way different parts of the brain work. And it's also demonstrable in neuronal physiology, for example, looking at density of mu receptors or looking at methylation within the nucleus accumbens. These are fascinating things for people like me, probably have little to no relevance to clinical behavior at this time, clinical practice at this point in time, but the nature of addiction is to change the way the brain functions, and this is not a change towards wellness either. But I think the primary nature of addiction is probably highlighted best in the 2001 edition of the AA Big Book, which is the 4th edition. It is on page 64. Bill W. talks about the primary nature of the spiritual side of addiction, and he points to the spiritual desolation and separation from God as being a primary factor in addiction, and says that without addressing the spiritual, the mental and physical don't get better. The way he puts it is when we address the spiritual nature and the spirituality, the mental and the emotional follow closely behind towards wellness. So again, just sort of a short summary, the nature of addiction is a progressive deterioration of the person who is addicted to a processor or to a substance, and it results in physical suffering and or death, and more importantly, results in separation from God and danger to the immortal soul. And the nature of addiction not only applies to the individual caught in the addiction, but also applies, as we would expect from the Catholic doctrine of the communion of saints, it applies to the family and friends of the people using drugs. It applies to the co-workers, to the employers, and it also extends to society in general, which suffers when people become addicted.
So the primary question that bioethicists use to determine the ethical nature of any intervention is, does this particular intervention offer a reasonable hope of benefit? It's very, very important in the practice of bioethics. Does this offer a reasonable hope of benefit? And so we have to come to understand, what is the meaning of benefit? Well, benefit, for the most part, is symptom relief. And if we're looking at a safe injection site, the benefit obviously would be the relief from withdrawal symptoms. Another meaning of benefit would be improved anatomical functioning and survival rates. And so, again, if we relate this to the safe injection site, this would be the relief from the consequences of use, which would be, say, problems with the law, which would be unsterile paraphernalia, needles, and what have you, and also overdose. And another, if we're relating this to the safe injection sites, it would be relief from the addiction itself.
So if you look at, from a medical perspective, what Steve's talking about in terms of symptom relief or improved anatomical functioning and survival rate, do safe injection sites offer any benefit? Well, they do offer a place where withdrawal can be relieved. In other words, they facilitate injection, which will relieve any withdrawal symptoms present. They will facilitate the reduction of shame. The staff and the personnel within a safe injection site will interact with injection drug user without any condemnatory or discriminatory behaviors. They will improve in anatomical functioning and will certainly help prevent premature death from things like overdose and hepatitis, and also will reduce transmission of diseases such as hepatitis C, hepatitis B, HIV, and any infections which might accompany injection drug use. However, I would posit that they do not offer benefit to the addict who is suffering from the disease, the process of addiction, whatever addiction is, whether you believe it's a moral failure or a disease is not important to me at this point in time. What is important is that the addiction itself will not be addressed. Very few patients, and this has been shown in studies within a safe injection site, will accept any offers of treatment. And it makes sense. We're facilitating the use of drugs. We're not making it hard for a person to use drugs. We're not making it difficult for them to leave the delusions of addiction. There is no impetus to change in a certain sense. And in a certain sense, they encourage the use of addiction by promoting a message to the user that it's okay to use drugs. The society and the government is providing a place for you to do a behavior which unenlightened people think is dangerous or bad for you. But I think there's also a hidden message that goes on with that as well, that says that this is the best that you can have. It's the best that society has to offer you. There is no such thing really as recovery. There's a few fanatics out there who talk about life without drugs, but it's not really possible for you. And even if it were, we don't have the resources to give to you, and or you are not worthy of any of the resources that it takes in order to really to provide flourishing again and freedom from addiction.
So what's the reality? The reality is, to establish that a safe injection site provides reasonable hope of benefit, that the benefit would need to be applied to more than just the administration and consumption of illicit drugs. The consumption of illicit drugs causes the physical, emotional, social, and spiritual harm to the user's friends and family and society. Facilitating their use, even in a less harmful manner, does not, in the natural course of events, lead to the conditions necessary for recovery from addiction. Therefore, safe injection sites do not offer reasonable hope of benefit to the user because they fail to provide for the motivation for change. This is extremely important because out there, what we see is people saying, well, this would offer reasonable hope of benefit for the reasons that Dr. Berger and myself had posited. But it's the reasonable hope of benefit has to come from something outside of the safe injection site. That is just the means to an end. And so when we look at the whole prospect of the bioethics, the means do not justify the ends. We've known that. We've talked about that for centuries in the Catholic tradition. And so we can't just say that there's a benefit to the site, but it's not a benefit to the person, because the ultimate benefit of the person is to give them health and well-being. And drugs do not offer health and well-being. So therefore, it cannot be a benefit to them. Another way of kind of unpacking the morality of the human act or the safe injection site is to look at this paradigm. Now, we know in the practice of bioethics that each human act, every individual human act has three sources of the morality: the object, which answers the question, what do I want to do? The end, which answers the questions, why do I want to do it? And the circumstance answers the question, how, when, and why, or where do I do this particular act? And the answer has to be positive for all these three. All three must be good if the act is going to be considered morally licit. So the object of the act is the consumption of illicit drugs. The consumption of illicit drugs is an intrinsically evil act. And we've known that, and the Catechism speaks to that, and the Catholic tradition speaks to that. The end is to curb the overdoses and the reduction of public nuisance. Now, this is a good intention. It truly is. But it doesn't change the evil of the object chosen. Intentions do not change that and cannot change an intrinsic evil. And the circumstance, sterile and supervised space to consume the illicit drugs. This is also a good intention and circumstance, but it doesn't change the evil of the object chosen. See, once you have an intrinsic evil, that by its very core, by its very nature, no good intention, no circumstance, nothing can change something that is evil. It just can't happen. Now, back in the 40s and 50s, after the Second World War and all the Nazi atrocities, the world needed to find a way of determining what is the principles for basic ethical practice in medicine. And Beauchamp and Childress, back a little later on, developed these 4 principles that we'll go over for this. Now, are they adequate? Maybe yes, maybe no. But at the same time, they're very important for us to consider when we're dealing with the understanding of safe injection sites. And so, and they devised these 4 principles of principalism to be conducive to everyone, regardless of religion, regardless of culture, regardless of any other cultural reality. Because these, if you look at them, are, as we go over them, we'll see that these are really natural law principles that are written in the human heart. So what is the first one? Beneficence. And that principle is always do the good. The second is non-maleficence, and that is do no harm. And we see do no harm basically in the Hippocratic Oath. Prima non nocere. First, do no harm. You know, it goes right back to that. Justice is upholding the rights of both the individual and the society. And autonomy is the freedom of the free and competent person to choose a course of action. Now, autonomy in the time of the Enlightenment was probably one of the foremost concerns that Immanuel Kant and others had seen as an intrinsic reality of the human person. Is their autonomy to do what is right and what is good, and the freedom to choose that course of action. So beneficence, always do the good.
So I would hope that at this point in time, the beneficence and the non-maleficence and the justice are evident, and we will continue to discuss these, but I would like to take this opportunity to talk about autonomy because this is an issue which is very easily misunderstood and I think can be controversial when talking about addiction. I think in addiction medicine, we always recognize the primary autonomy of the person that I'm dealing with to choose recovery or not to choose recovery. In other words, to choose to continue in their addiction or choose to try to leave their addiction. My role as an addiction medicine physician is to facilitate and help coordinate services for those who choose to leave addiction, for those who are choosing to recover, to return to good health, to flourish, to make society safer, more a sounder society, a more flourishing society, to stop harm to relatives and friends and coworkers and employers, the harm that comes from addiction. But in addiction, there exists, in the addicted individual, there exists a certain impairment of autonomy that is difficult for someone to understand who is not either not an addict or alcoholic, or someone who does not work with them every day, such as myself. And I think this can be very, very difficult to understand. I would like to talk about this by referring to a priest recently admitted here to Guest House. He is a good man, a devout priest, a holy man with an active prayer life, and he is an alcoholic. He described to me very clearly the diminishment of autonomy that comes in alcoholism when he talked about the daily struggle every morning that goes on inside, where he can see clearly within his mind that drinking is not good, it's not producing good. But when it comes to an actual decision sometime later in the day, with the pressures of the day and the emotional turmoil that comes and the pressures of everything else weighing in on him, where the values tip, where the use of alcohol becomes acceptable for this minute, and once acceptable for this minute, extend to the rest of the afternoon. I can't tell you the anguish in his eyes as he talks to me about this struggle that goes on inside of him, sort of almost a dualism, where he senses within himself a destructive tendency and a life-giving tendency, and his failure to be able to hold on to the life-giving tendency. I don't know that we will be able to talk about this in terms of neuronal function or determinism or any other kind of reductionistic philosophy. This is simply the struggle that every addicted person goes through, that diminishes their autonomy, their ability to make a choice and hang to it. I think it was probably, there are a couple of sayings within the recovery community that really nicely address this. They talk about, one old description of the progression of alcoholism talks about, first the man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink, and then drink takes the man, talking about the diminishment of autonomy that happens. Another way that I've heard it described by a Catholic ethicist was that addiction is a disease which hardens the heart and weakens the will. Again, he threw in that concept of disease. I'm not asking you to believe that, but I'm asking you that this is what happens in addiction, whether we understand it or not, and I certainly don't understand it fully myself after 35 years of working in the field. I can tell you there's a reality that every person who is struggling with addiction struggles with. And it's the reason why nobody ever gets up in the morning and says, oh, what a great day to go into treatment, or this is a wonderful day to stop using. And then is able to construct a strategy and hold to it by themselves that leads them out of addiction into recovery.
You know, as you were talking, Jeff, I was thinking in terms of the Enlightenment's origins, the Enlightenment's emphasis on autonomy. And what that was saying to me is that the problems associated with safe injection sites, it's not a problem that the Catholic Church is alone in. I mean, we may be addressing it from a Catholic perspective and a spiritual perspective, and we ought to. But this goes beyond just theology. It goes into the very core of the secular understanding of bioethics. It does. And we have to be cognizant of that, because it's very important to know that the church isn't alone in this, although it may seem that way, because, you know, we're the ones who are making, you know, some hay over all this stuff. But this is really a humanist understanding too. The humanism of, you know, who the person is, what is the, you know, transcendence of the human person. And that's simply universal. This is not just a Catholic problem. It's a transcendent problem. So I'm sorry, Jeff, you can continue there.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
So now we look at human dignity. And this is a quote from the Catechism. I think it's important that we read it. The dignity of the human person is rooted in its creation as the image and likeness of God. It fulfills his vocation to divine beatitude. It is essential to the human being to freely direct himself to this fulfillment. And again, I want to repeat that last phrase. Freely direct himself to this fulfillment. And so we have to also, as we move forward, examine what the common good is. And again, from the Catechism, we're speaking, by the common good is to be understood that the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment. Again, we hear this term fulfillment one more time, more fully and more easily. The common good concerns the life of all. It calls for prudence from each, and even more so from those who exercise the office of authority. And that's going to be critical as we move forward with this presentation. Prudence of people and prudence of the government, basically. So some questions here now. Do governments that sanction safe injection sites ensure the social stability and security of its citizens as the common good demands of them? And the answer is a resounding no. Behaviors that produce crime, which drug addiction does, such as stealing money or goods to finance drug use, are not affected by the availability of safe injection sites. And there's a lot of research involved in this that talks about how crime did not go down in the areas that these safe injection sites are available to people. So let's talk about basic human rights, because human rights is a big buzz term now in the culture, especially the American culture, where we see, human rights violations in this regard, in that regard, and in the other regard. So harm reduction is, in fact, a basic human right. But this right is independent of the means of achieving it. Again, we have to really look at the maxim, the ends do not justify the means.
So there are, for the purported benefits and of safe injection sites, the basic human right to harm reduction, are there non-objectionable, morally non-objectionable means of reducing harm that might be accompany addiction? And the answer is yes. And one of the problems that I see with safe injection sites is they filter resources and finances away from ways that might reduce harm, which are morally illicit. I'm referring to simple things like vaccination programs for hepatitis B, the financing of perhaps, quote, warp speed, unquote, development of hepatitis C vaccines. That development is currently in progress, but it's proceeding at a less than warp speed pace. The financing of centers which address some of the suffering that comes from addiction, and may also reach out to the family and friends. Salvation Army does this, as Catholic Social Services can do this, other organizations do this to help reduce some of the suffering that accompanies addiction. They also offer treatment, financing of treatment, so that would address the addiction itself, and also then the problems psychologically and physically and that come from that arise in people who are related to those who are suffering from addiction. Again, these are all good things, I think, which would be reducing the harm from addiction, and they're morally non-objectionable. And again, I would point out that the safe injection sites siphon money from these types of interventions into an intervention which Archbishop Chaput called an intervention of despair that facilitates continued addiction.
So harm reduction is a basic human right, and we know that. But with every right, there's a corresponding duty. And so the duty, as we see it, is of the government to provide the means, the legitimate means to reduce their harm by the way of the means that Dr. Berger had just cited to us. But there is no right to a safe injection site. So we have yes to harm reduction as a right. The corresponding duty is for government authorities to point people into ways that are going to be able to reduce that harm, that does not advocate for or offer a continual infiltration of injectable drugs into a person's system.
So again, I wanted to just here to stress the fact that as we talk with, as Steve goes on to talk about cooperation and evil, we need to keep in mind that addiction by itself is an intrinsic evil, that it is and results in great suffering and harm to the addict, to society, to friends and family, employers, and everyone else connected with that person.
The principal agent is the one who does the illicit act or the immoral act or the intrinsically evil act. This person is morally culpable for this, and in this case, it is the injection of illicit drugs. Now, in this instance, there are some mitigating factors.
So mitigating factors then would affect the culpability of the injecting drug user. And just to give a couple of them, a person can take licitly prescribed drugs. In other words, they may get pain medication prescribed for their back pain from their physician, and they may use them appropriately. However, in some people, this use will not stop. Again, I had a priest recently admitted who talked about his use of alcohol, and he said, I knew it wasn't normal in when I was in college because I could never drink one drink. One drink always resulted in 10. And again, this is difficult for people who are not suffering from addiction to understand, but this is demonstrable over and over and over again in addictive behavior. And so the decision then to move to illicit drugs and using what we would certainly think of as inappropriate use of them may be not made with full knowledge and or deliberate consent because the addiction itself will derive things in this direction. Again, to get some examples to this, a typical progression for opiate users in our society in this day is to begin with using prescription opiates, oxycodone or hydrocodone, and eventually, because of the cost of oral drugs and the lack of euphoria that accompanies them, they will move gradually towards injection of heroin. And this, again, is a natural history. We see this over and over again. I don't think it's necessary to talk about what drives that. But if we understand that it is a fact and that the decision is never made at the beginning to set out to become an illicit drug user. The other thing, and again, this is the second point in this, addiction, when it's established, presents an impediment to the will in the sense that we talked about it earlier with regards to autonomy. So these things can mitigate the culpability of the injection drug user.
So now the cooperator is one who cooperates with the principal agent. And so we have now another delineation that needs to be made. We have formal cooperation, which we'll speak about now, and then we have the material cooperator, which we'll speak about at the next slide. But a formal cooperator is one who intends the evil act to occur. either by itself for its own sake or as a means to another end, which in this instance, as we've been speaking all along, is for the means to harm reduction. Now, government officials and persons in the public and private sectors who establish safe injection sites are formal cooperators because they intend this evil act to continue and to perpetrate. And so these individuals are fully culpable for the intrinsically evil act. They lock, stock, and barrel, assume the culpability of the immoral act. The material cooperator now is one who does not intend the evil act to occur, but provides the material for its commission and is material cooperating in evil. Now, one may say that this is a person who is involved with this injection site in some way. We don't know the human heart or the human mind, so we can't say that they don't definitively that they don't intend this evil act to happen. But at the same time, it's highly unlikely that they're not intending something that they're actually doing. And so we have to say that in some regard, this person is an implicit material cooperator, because without that person, it can't happen. And we'll see this in the next slide, because material cooperation is divided into two categories: the immediate and the immediate cooperation. So immediate material cooperation is a person who is indispensable for the act to occur, provides immediate material cooperation. Okay, and so, you know, the person who's filling the syringe that the person is going to inject in himself, or the person who provides the alcohol swabs for this act to occur. These persons are providing the means, the indispensable means for this particular act of injection of illicit drugs. And so, regardless of whether they intend it or not, they are fully culpable of this evil act. It's a scary reality when you think about it. The immediate material cooperator is a person who is not indispensable for the act to occur, but whatever this person does leads to the occurrence of the evil act and provides, therefore, immediate material cooperation. These persons are the administrative staff who schedule, maintain records, financial accounting. These are all immediate material cooperators. This staff provides the assistance for the evil act to occur, which from their activity, now this is going to lead for this evil act to occur. And so they share in the culpability of the immoral act. They share in the culpability. Now, one may ask, well, are they fully culpable? That's a question that only God can answer, because we don't know the human heart. But it's still serious business here. They're not scot-free.
Well, Steve, I believe you're also saying in this that, for example, a social worker who goes into a safe injection site and is employed by a safe injection site, who has the intention every day of going in and motivating people for recovery, that person would not share in the culpability of the evil act. They would not be immediate material cooperators. Is that correct?
I would say so, because their intention is going into this place for the rehabilitation, the legitimate rehabilitations of these persons. They're going in as an act of charity. And so even though they're moving into a facility that has intrinsic evil associated with it, their intent is to go into the lion's den, so to say, and to try to be able to bring them some type of hope and benefit and recovery. So you're correct, they don't share in any cooperation. So what are our conclusions? The science and the medical facts point to the illegitimacy of safe injection sites. The bioethical principles point to the illegitimacy of safe injection sites. And because all these things converge in a perfect storm, government bodies who enable this and clinicians who staff these facilities are liable, they're culpable of this immoral act. So we thank you for your time, and we'd like to entertain some comments or questions. We'll be glad to answer them for you. In the meantime, before we do so, I'd like to just point to the idea that these are ways that you can contact us. The site is listed here for read the full article, which I would encourage you to do. We both encourage you to do. And please do not hesitate to email us or call us for more information. If there's a way that we could help you in your own municipality, that's why we did this here. So we do what we can to help the cause and to help you do what you do best. So again, I invite questions and comments.